Okay.
All right, everybody, thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the Lake Sturgeon of the St. Croix and Namekagon Rivers, what we know about this living dinosaur. My name is Katie Sickman, and I'm the Natural Resources Manager for the Wild Rivers Conservancy of the St. Croix and Namekagon.
And I'm Katrina Schlicker. I'm the outdoor educator for Wild Rivers Conservancy. The Conservancy is the official nonprofit partner of the St. Croix National Scenic Riverway, a unit of the National Park Service. The Conservancy inspires stewardship to forever ensure the rare ecological integrity of the St. Croix and Namekagon Riverway. As a nonprofit, we depend on the support of individuals and businesses throughout the watershed to carry out our important mission. If you're inspired by our work today, please consider becoming a donor, volunteering, or participating in one of our many upcoming events. And for those of you who are already supporters, thank you.
All right, so before we begin, we would like to take a few moments to talk about housekeeping. To ensure the best video quality, please keep your camera off and remain on mute. This program will also be recorded and a link will be sent out to you in the next few days. The recording will also be available to view on the Conservancy's YouTube channel.
If you've ever seen a lake sturgeon in the St. Croix or Namekagon Rivers, consider yourself lucky. This living dinosaur and namesake of the Namekagon River is much more than just a big fish. In today's Lunch and Learn, we'll dive more into these magnificent creatures and why they're so important to our watershed.
All right, so our presenter today is going to be Craig Roberts. Craig Roberts has worked as a fisheries biologist in Spooner, Wisconsin for 8 years. Prior to Wisconsin, he worked in fisheries in Indiana, Alabama, New Mexico, and Kentucky. Outside of work, Craig enjoys hunting, fishing, running, and watching college basketball. He lives in Spooner with his wife and 2 young boys. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat window at any time during the presentation. There will be time for Craig to answer your questions at the end of the session.
And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and send it over to you, Craig.
All right, well, thank you everyone for inviting me to give this talk. I will pull up my screen here. Do you all see my screen?
Yep, we see it.
Okay. And slideshow.
You're good.
Perfect.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for, give me 1 second. I need to move this around a bit. All right. Minimize. So I'm also gonna stop my video here. All righty. So today I'm going to talk about lake sturgeon as a whole, as a species on the Namekagon River and the St. Croix River, but also talk about lake sturgeon in the United States, the status of lake sturgeon, how they, how they're an important species, a living dinosaur. So I'm just going to talk broadly about lake sturgeon and then focus it back to work we do on the Namekagon and St. Croix River in the Wisconsin DNR. So there it goes. How many of you have seen this while paddling down either the St. Croix or the Namekagon? Most likely the Namekagon. I personally have experienced this many times, been fortunate to paddle down the river, and you're paddling, you're in a canoe or a kayak, and you see a fish that's 4 to 5 feet long. It's a just a big fish. And your first reaction is, wow, what is that? Is it a shark? It's a great big fish right beside you. And then you realize, oh, it's a lake sturgeon, and it's really just sunbathing. It's sitting there, and you're struck with awe, wonder, and then you realize, wow, that it's kind of amazing these fish are even here. And that's the same feeling I get, even though I've handled small ones, I've handled large ones in my job. I've been very fortunate to work with lake sturgeon. in this area. And I still, even though I've worked with them a lot, I still get that same feeling when I'm going down, you know, from Trigo to the confluence in that area. I've seen them a lot, and I still get the same feeling like, wow, there's a lake sturgeon. So I just wanted to share that, you know, that's something I get a lot too. And they're not a scary fish per se. A lot of people say they're so big, they're scary. There's nothing to be scared of about a lake sturgeon. I'll just say that as well. So I'll jump into more about the sturgeon itself. So what are lake sturgeon? Where were they originally found in the United States, and where are they found now? So their range is much less than it was historically. I'll talk about sampling for lake sturgeon that the DNR does. It's actually not very complicated. And then I'll talk about how we think they're doing on the Namekagon River, how we think they're doing on the Upper St. Croix River, how much they can move within these systems. And then to close, I'm going to just talk about some other facts, you know, things we've learned about sturgeon population in this part of Northwest Wisconsin. So first, lake sturgeon are a living dinosaur. They first appeared in the fossil record around 100 million years ago, which is kind of the end of the Cretaceous period. There were still dinosaurs present on Earth at that time. This image on the right is actually fossilized scutes, which are kind of lake sturgeon's version of a scale. I'll talk about that in the next slide. And lake sturgeon still have characteristics of primitive fishes. So these characteristics include those, so they have like a bony head, bony operculum. For people who haven't handled a lake sturgeon, it's hard to describe, but it's a much harder operculum than, say, a bass or a pike or other more common fish species. And then they have these scutes, which you can see in this image. It's not the greatest image, but when you see the juvenile fish picture in a few slides, you'll see what I'm talking about in better detail. And then unlike other fish, they have skin, and they have kind of sandpaper-like skin. It's not slimy like a catfish, and it's not just scales like a bass or a bluegill. It's just kind of skin, and there's no slime. There's not as much of a slime coating like you see in other fish species. And then their overall shape of a sturgeon is more shark-like and less, less similar to a bass or a pike. And then the last thing I want to mention is they feed mostly on the bottom. So they have these barbels. You can't see it here, but they have a sucker-like mouth that protrudes down when they're feeding. And they're well adapted for feeding on the bottom. Here's an image I used from Michigan Sea Grant, and it shows, very simply the life stages of lake sturgeon. So they start out by spawning, and then they have, they create eggs which are fertilized and stick to rocks. There's a free embryo stage that settles between those rocks and stays there until their yolk sac is mostly used up. And then that becomes the larval stage, which drifts downstream if it's a river setting. And then the early stage juvenile is probably 6 to 8 inches. They're smaller, they're very spiny and spiky. And then they actually have some modeling for more camouflage. And then they pass to what's the juvenile stage. And this stage for sturgeon is a very long time. It takes them a long time to reach maturity. And then sturgeon become adults and devote a lot more energy from growth to making eggs and milt. And spawning occurs in gravel or cobble substrate, mainly in river systems, and they prefer 50 to 60 degree water temperature. Different parts of our state in Wisconsin, so you go over by Lake Winnebago, it's generally a little colder. The Yellow River system and probably the St. Croix tends to be more like 60 degrees when sturgeon will be spawning. And they have what's called natal homing. So they're similar to salmon in the ability that they have the ability to find the spot where they were born. And then as this image shows on the left, multiple males will surround one female while the spawning event occurs. And then their eggs are fairly large and they're black, which is a little different from most fish. You know, bluegill, crappie, bass, other species, the eggs tend to be more yellow in coloration. I don't know if that's an adaptive strategy or just a characteristic they carry from being a more primitive fish. Their eggs will hatch in 5 to 12 days, depending on the water temperature. And then they start feeding when they're just over 1/2 inch in size. Okay, the juvenile stage, which I said lasts a long time. This image on the right was taken from a hatchery fish that we stocked in Trigo Lake. This is an early juvenile or what we would call a fingerling. And this fish, you can see, has very spiky scutes. Those scutes are so sharp that they would cut your hand if you grab the fish the wrong way. So at that stage of their life, they're very, it's hard for another fish to eat them because it's like eating a cactus. They have very good protection. And that's how sturgeon can survive really well at a young age. And they also have this fish didn't have it in particular, but they will have mottling to camouflage with the bottom. And I have seen on the Namekagon in particular, where there's juveniles that have that mottling. They're very difficult to see, but they can be present on a clear sunny day if you know what you're looking for. And then juveniles will grow quickly. Before they start producing eggs and milk, they actually grow very fast. And then once they reach, it takes a long time to reach maturity. Females, it takes around 25 years. And males, it takes between 15 and 20 years. So as a long-lived fish, it takes them a long time to mature. And then even the spawning event, so to spawn, a female only spawns once every 2 to 5 years and a male every 2 years. So by comparison, any of your other game fish spawn every year, generally. And then males can live as long as 65 to 90 years, and females have been documented at over 150 years. So very long-lived old fish. And then this image right here just shows where this was on the Yellow River, where some adults were spawning near a bridge in that system. And then Lake Sturgeon also get really big. That's one of the neatest parts for me, is that, we can see fish upwards of 70, 80 inches in some of our systems around here. So this image on the left was from Manitoba. This fish was estimated over 300 pounds. Historical records being what they are, that may not be exactly right. This fish, however, on the right was from 2022 in the Lake St. Clair in Michigan. This was a 250-pound sturgeon, and this was from 2022. And then this image in the middle is from the Yellow River in Burnett County. That fish was 70 inches long, and that fish was also probably 70 to 80 pounds. So that was a fish local, a system that flows into the St. Croix River. So how do sturgeon get so big? Initial thoughts would be they have to be eating other fish, or what are they eating to get so big? Well, they actually feed on small invertebrates. They predominantly feed on snails, clams, various forms of insect larvae, crayfish, and leeches. And many studies find that they feed predominantly on chironomids, which is this image, the lower left image. And sometimes they're called bloodworms if they're red, but there's many species of chironomids that live in lakes. The adult form is known as lake flies. So sturgeon have found a niche where they can feed on the bottom and feed on these invertebrates and grow to large sizes doing that. And then they tend to use the deeper sections of rivers and large shallow expanses of lakes to feed in. So this is a USGS image of the original native range for lake sturgeon in North America. And you can see at one point in time, lake sturgeon were found all the way down to Alabama and, west to the Dakotas, and then east to, New York in that area. And then what this map doesn't show is their range up into Canada. They go a fair ways up into Canada as well. And that has been diminished through time. So now this is probably a more accurate depiction, and even some of these images, or this, I should say what this is first. This is a map of the current range. So the green depicts where we still think lake sturgeon are, the red where they're extirpated or possibly extirpated. And you see that most of the Southeast and, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, and then areas of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota no longer have sturgeon. We are very fortunate in Northwest Wisconsin, where we still have many healthy lake sturgeon populations. And I would question even some of these green marks in Illinois. There probably are sturgeon there, but they may not be reproducing. They may be stocked populations. And, a lot of that's happened in the 1900s. So what caused declines in lake sturgeon on a nationwide scale? Well, a lot of it was European settlement and the impacts from that. So our local tribes have oral histories of hearing lake sturgeon spawning bank to bank. And as most of you probably know, Namekagon, the name Namekagon means place of sturgeon or river of sturgeon. So at one point in time, there were a lot more sturgeon present in the river. Europeans initially did not like sturgeon. So when they'd be fishing or netting for other fish, they would just kill them. They wouldn't use them. And then German immigrants began a caviar industry and heavily exploited them. And the problem with exploiting a long-lived fish is it takes a really long time to recover. And that's kind of what we've seen. And this exploitation caused a severe decline. And then you add pollution and dam building, and it just has created a lot of issues with lake sturgeon populations in the country. In our state, in Wisconsin, conservation started in the 1900s, and now harvest of lake sturgeon is closely monitored. So we went from, no real regulations on sturgeon, and then now DNR introduced quotas and limits in the 1900s. Spearing for Lake Sturgeon is only allowed in the Lake Winnebago system. There is some tribal spearing in Wisconsin, but in general, that is very tightly monitored. And then angling harvest is only allowed in a few water bodies in our state as well, and river systems. But it's fairly closely monitored also. And you're allowed one fish per year, and it has to be 60 inches long. So it's a pretty low harvest rate compared to what it was 100 years ago. And there is no harvest allowed in most of the National Scenic Riverway. There is a harvest season, I believe, below St. Croix Falls, but the section that we look at, which is along Burnett County and the Namekagon River, there's currently a catch and release season. I'll discuss that next. So this is just a brief outline of the regulation history. In 1960, that was the first time there was any real size limits. It was a 40-inch minimum. That was increased to 45 inches and then to 50. Then there was a season added. And then in the 1990s and 1994, Minnesota and Wisconsin closed the season on the St. Croix River in particular. And then just recently in 2016, we opened a catch and release season on the Upper St. Croix River above St. Croix Falls. And then the season is still closed on the Namekagon River. So going back full circle, I just want to mention, in general, Wisconsin does have healthier populations of lake sturgeon. And within the National Scenic Riverway, they are found throughout. So we find them in the Namekagon and we find them in the St. Croix. And this map, this highlighted map, basically shows the area where that we cover out of Spooner and that we sample. So we don't sample every square mile of the Namekagon from Hayward to the confluence and every square mile along Burnett County, but we get to a fair amount of these locations and look for sturgeon throughout the summer. So what does sampling look like? For us, we mainly use hook and line sampling, and that happens from June through September. We decided to do this through trying many different gears. We tried short set gill nets, which is another method you can use. We've tried trot lines, which are set overnight, and hook and line sampling is kind of the most effective for our area because the Namekagon and St. Croix in our area tends to be shallow, tends to be harder to sample with those other methods. So we sample throughout the summer months. We tag the fish when we catch them in two ways. We use a pit tag, which I'll talk more about later, and we use what's called a dangler tag. On this image on the right, you can see the yellow dangler tag kind of hanging off this fish's dorsal fin. When the tag has been there for a while on the fish, that tag will get covered in algae, but it is always present on that tagged fish unless the fish outgrows it, and that takes a really long time. We also take length, weight, and age of these fish, and we age them. I'll discuss how we age them on the next slide. And then we're basically looking at three subpopulations. So we look at what I'll call the Upper Namekagon, the Lower Namekagon, and the Upper St. Croix Rivers. For aging, we take a clip out of the pectoral fin, right very close to where it touches the fish's body. We take a fin clip, and then we cross-section that, and look at it through the microscope. And these, on the image on the left, you see all of these rings. Those rings are kind of like a cross section of a tree where you can count the rings and get a rough estimate of how old a fish is. So that allows us to get an idea of how old that fish is and tell us whether it's an adult, a juvenile, and just give us an idea of for age. And this is what sampling looks like. It doesn't look so bad and most of the time. Is it always like this? No, but most of the time when we sample, it's a clear day and we put about 4 lines out at a time and we try to get some sturgeon. And some days it's, some days we get a lot, and that's 10 to 15 fish. And some days we only get, 0 or 1, and it varies. But in a good year, we can sample 100 sturgeon in various parts of the St. Croix. And in a not as good year, you only get 50. It just varies based on the weather, the river conditions, that sort of thing. So first, I'll talk about what I'll call the Upper Namekagon River, and that's from Hayward to the Trigo Dam. So this population is a remnant population. It was probably extirpated because of the Trigo Dam. And we started putting rehab stockings in 1995, and we've continued that work ever since. The fish that we put in are spawned from Yellow Lake Sturgeon, and every fish that we put in the Namekagon River, we place a pit tag in the fish. So what's a pit tag? A pit tag is called a passive integrative transponder. And you inject that small tag into the back of the fish's head, and that'll stay with the fish throughout its life. And anytime we scan that, we can get a unique code for each individual fish. So we know that fish came from our hatchery stocking in 2008, for example, and so on and so forth. So it tells us what year it was stocked. It tells us how big it was when it was stocked versus what it is now, and just gives us an idea if there's natural fish versus stocked fish in the system. So here are kind of some preliminary results. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, but basically upstream of Trigo Lake, we haven't seen any natural reproduction of lake sturgeon. All of those fish that we find have been stocked fish, and that's just part of that is how many stockings that we've put in. The fish probably just aren't old enough yet to try to spawn. The average size is around 29 inches, so still mostly juvenile fish. To be adults, generally they need to be greater than 45 inches. And so we think this population is still recovering and not reproducing. And we also haven't seen any known spawning congregations. Next, I'll talk about what I'll call the Lower Namekagon, and that's from Trigo Dam to the confluence with the St. Croix. This population, this segment, we look at with our fisheries research staff in Spooner, and they actually did a more in-depth study of this area in 2008 to 2012, and that's some of the data I'm going to share right now. So with the Lower Namekagon, we did have some data from the 1960s. This graph on the left shows number of fish caught on the vertical axis, and then the horizontal axis shows total length. That it is in centimeters, but I converted it for you on the right here. This big bump in gray, that's from the 1960s. That's at that time, fish only averaged 20 inches. So there were many juveniles at that time. And then when we most recently looked at it in 2008 to 2012, the average size was around 33 inches. So increase in average size was quite a bit, suggesting there's more adults in the population, fewer juveniles. And then most recently, when we got some fish in 2022, the size range was from 18 to 52 inches and around a 29-inch average. So there's still a lot of juveniles in this population. And that's something that we're seeing as well in the St. Croix. And I'll talk about that right after this. So next, we look at the St. Croix River, and we look at the St. Croix River basically from that area, the confluence to the Burnett County line. So not quite to the top of the Indian Head flowage. We don't make it further south than Highway O area, if you all are familiar with that. And we go to several different locations on the St. Croix. And it kind of depends on how often we've been to each location. We try to spread our effort out up and down the river. And same sort of scenario that we've seen on the lower Namekagon. There's a 28-inch average in 2022. The population is still mostly made up of juveniles, and we capture very few fish that can be considered adults. And as you can see in this graph on the right, a majority of the fish we get are from 15 to probably 35 inches. When we collect the fish, generally we take an aging structure. It depends if it's a recapture or not. And this year we got a lot of new fish. So we took aging from 99 fish on the Upper St. Croix. And this graph kind of shows more about, how young the fish are that we're seeing. So a lot of our fish that we aged were from 2 to 10 years old, which is, a lot of juvenile fish, considering we see a full size range, but only 11% would be old enough to be considered adults. And we don't know, one thing I'll mention too, is we don't know for sure where the spawning areas are for the St. Croix River, because we're often working on the Yellow River in the spring, which is around the same time they'd be spawning on the St. Croix. We haven't pinpointed those locations. It's something that we're hoping to learn more about. It's an area of research need for us. But at this time, we know that based on our assessments, there's still mostly juvenile young fish in the Upper St. Croix. Okay, another really neat, facts about Lake Sturgeon is they like to move. They can really travel when they want to. They can also, be content to sit in one spot. We know from our tagging efforts, from our own recaptures, from angler reports, that the Lake Sturgeon move throughout the Namekagon and the St. Croix. They move all over the place. They'll move up into the Tatagatik River. They'll move into the Kettle and the Snake in Minnesota. And then obviously in the Namekagon. We also know that dams impede their movement. So we'll get recaptures below Trigo Dam, or we'll get recaptures below the St. Croix Falls Dam of our fish, fish that we've tagged above those dams. And a lot of times in those scenarios, especially if we have fish that leave the Upper St. Croix for the Lower St. Croix, they're not coming back. We know that they've left, and there's not a way for them to travel back up. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but we don't know how often that occurs. And then we know from angler reports, sometimes fish will sit in one area for a long time. So for example, there's a lake sturgeon that we get a tag report very often near Whispering Pines. And I don't know, if there's resources there for that particular fish, or if it just really likes the Whispering Pines area, but that fish has been reported several times in the same 1 mile stretch of river in the summertime. And then they also sometimes will move great distances for unknown reasons. So this is another area that we're trying to learn more about, but would be a great project for, a university or a graduate student in Northwest Wisconsin. And here's an example of just how far they can move. So this is probably one of the farthest I've seen, but we tagged this fish up near Soderbeck Landing in 2021. It was 17 inches. And then this fall in 2022, an angler in Minnesota reported it down near a power plant. And it traveled roughly 71 miles from where it had been. And it was grown about an inch during that time frame. And I put the two squares, so the top square is Spooner and the bottom square is the Twin Cities. So from north south, it's roughly the distance between Spooner and the Twin Cities. So a long ways for such a small fish. And that brings about another point, the importance of angler tagging reports. So we get reports, especially on the St. Croix River, and that helps us learn a lot about these fish. It helped us learn in that case about movement. It helps us know roughly how old they are and how much they've grown. And then it gives us an educational opportunity with anglers. And this lady was very nice. She was kind enough to report the fish, but I had to politely inform her that, holding a heavy lake sturgeon by its operculum, by its gill flaps like that can be hard on it. It's not the best for a heavy fish. And instead, please hold the fish, under the belly if you're going to release it. So that's a case where it gave me an opportunity to work with that angler and give her, a better method when she's fishing for lake sturgeon. And then on the Namekagon River, the season is technically closed on the Namekagon River. However, we do have folks who catch them while fishing for walleye, catfish, red horse, other species that are present. And it has helped us learn more about that system. We've learned of fish that we stocked moving either through or over the Trigo Dam and surviving up to 40 inches long, because anglers below, caught them by Trigo Dam or downstream of Trigo Dam. Okay, now I'm going to talk about some other interesting facts that we've learned recently about lake sturgeon in general and in our area. So we genetically tested some of these populations a few years ago and found out that the St. Croix fish, being fish from the Upper St. Croix, fish from the Lower St. Croix, so below St. Croix Falls, and then fish from the Yellow River are unique genetically in Wisconsin compared to other populations. We don't really know why this is, but it was an important discovery, especially for our stocking protocols in Wisconsin. We also recently found out that there's a herpes virus that lake sturgeon have in Wisconsin. So we found this on sturgeon in Yellow Lake in 2019, or documented it. It's also found, on the Wisconsin River, Winnebago, and many other populations throughout the state. We aren't sure at this time if this virus is harmful to sturgeon, or if it's just a virus they've had and we discovered it, more or less. So we're still trying to learn more about that as we collect more data. Okay, last thing I'm going to mention is just our Yellow River sturgeon spawning operation. So a lot of our assessment happens on the Yellow River in the spring because it is a hook and line fishery in Burnett County. We also use that population to raise fingerlings that get stocked in back into the Namekagon above Trigo, but also in the Eau Claire River and the Upper St. Croix River in Douglas and Bayfield counties. And these fish are raised at Wild Rose, which is over by closer to Lake Winnebago. And we pit tag every fish that's going into the Namekagon River. So that's what I have. In summary, the St. Croix Namekagon Rivers are home to healthy yet recovering sturgeon populations, mostly juvenile sturgeon. It's just going to take time and more monitoring to fully understand if this population will have more adults. We have other populations in Wisconsin that suggest there should be more adults in the river systems, but we're just going to have to, let time tell us more about that. And then, like I've mentioned a couple of times, there are many research opportunities in this part of the state for lake sturgeon, just to learn more about their movement, their diet, their juvenile stages, how they where they're spawning. There's many questions that need to be answered there. Speaking of questions, I am done, and with that, I'll take any at this time. Did I lose everybody?
Nope, I got you. I just pressed the wrong button. Okay, so I'm looking, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we will be asking them. The first question we got was from Wendy, and she said 2 questions.
Okay.
What dams are impeding sturgeon movement? And do you see your research heading south into the lower St. Croix, and what prevents expanding that scope?
Say the first one again. I'll answer that one first.
What dams are impeding sturgeon movement?
So in our area, there are many dams. There's Trigo Dam, Hayward Dam, the dam the Tatagatik River Dam on the Minong flowage. I don't know the name of that one off the top of my head. The Yellow River Dam that's below Yellow Lake. The dam on the Clam River. So there were many rivers that had lake sturgeon in them prior to Europeans placing those structures on the river systems where we know lake sturgeon were present before. And there's now remnant populations in those areas. So like the Tatagatik River, for example, had lake sturgeon above Minong flowage. The Clam River, there's still some remnant population above Clam River flowage. And then the Yellow River, obviously, there still is a population above in Yellow Lake, but before those dams were in place, they likely all intermingled. And that's no longer the case. Well, and then the second part.
Do you see your research heading south into the lower St. Croix, and what prevents expanding that scope?
So I work on these populations because of my management area. I cover Washburn and Burnett counties. Casey Yalali, who is the Wisconsin fisheries biologist based out of Baldwin, actually works on the St. Croix River below St. Croix Falls. We do meet, so we meet with, kind of have a big meeting with Minnesota, DNR, Casey's there, with all the river biologists once a year and discuss things like sturgeon tagging and sharing that data and kind of how we can work better in a more collaborative fashion on that front. But we've never made an effort, I would say, to combine all of our data and see how much movement's really occurring. That's a research need for sure. So.
Awesome. All right. So next question is from John. He asks, are there similar study or stocking efforts on the Minnesota side of the St. Croix?
So for a long time, Minnesota DNR out of Hinckley, John Frank is the biologist there. He works on the kettle and the snake, and then they were tagging fish as well in the Upper St. Croix River. I'm not sure that they're doing that to the extent that they used to, based on conversations I've had with him recently. But yes, they do similar work, and we share data with each other. You know, and then like if they get a tag report, for example, that tag report I had where the fish was 71 miles downstream, that was a tag report from Minnesota DNR that they gave to us, that came back to me. So we communicate with each other on that. And that helps us, you know, basically learn more about these fish and how far they can move through the system.
Awesome. Another question from Troy. How frequently do sturgeon go over the dam at St. Croix Falls? We do find sturgeon with damaged notochords floating in the river below the dam, perhaps 2 or 3 in the last 10 years.
Yeah, I'd say we get 1 report a year, at least, if not more than that, where it's a fish we've tagged and it goes over the St. Croix Falls Dam and ends up reported downstream somewhere. So thinking, you know, I don't know what proportion of the population we've tagged, but knowing that it's only a small proportion, there's probably a fair amount of fish that go over that dam, never to come back to the area we work in.
All right, so Dave asks, do you see the sturgeon move north to south in the fall towards the St. Croix Falls Dam for wintering, similar to smallmouth?
I don't know that we do. And I actually would, you know, I would think they overwinter in pools, but we've sampled them on the St. Croix River in particular. This year, it actually lingered into October, and they were in the same areas that they always are, you know, deeper. So we see them in deeper runs, deeper pools, and that's, we were there, and it was like a 40-degree day in October and caught a couple sturgeon. So they may not move as much as a smallmouth, but you know, the thing about lake sturgeon is they're so big, so powerful, and can swim probably very fast when they want to. It may not take them but a day or two to cover that mileage and get down to a wintering area. That's just another great example of movement study needs that we have. Yeah.
Our next question is from Karen. Any evidence that sturgeon eat Chinese mystery snails?
That study has not been done. I do not know the answer to that, unfortunately. So yeah, that's a tough one. I think a lot of people would be very happy and want us to stock them all over if they did, because we have plenty of lakes that have those, but I don't know the answer to that one, unfortunately.
All right. From Deb, how could we participate in sturgeon research?
So, the one I mentioned towards the end is if you're fishing on the river and you catch a lake sturgeon and it has a tag, please report it to me or anybody within DNR, and we'll get it to the right folks. So if it's not my tag or if you're on a different part of the St. Croix, so you're on the lower St. Croix, that's the best way. Especially given that now there's a large opportunity for folks who like to fish where they can go and catch and release sturgeon most of the year. I know even down by St. Croix Falls, people will ice fish for them. And so that's useful information for us to learn more about this population for sure.
Great.
Cool. From Peter, in the lower St. Croix, I often hear breaching of large fish. Are they sturgeon or something else?
You say breaching?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so jumping. Yeah, that's very common for lake sturgeon, especially in a wide slow spot or a lake. They'll do that, and there's a lot of theories why they do that. The latest theory I've heard is that they're trying to knock parasites off of their body, but no one knows for sure why they do that. It's just something unique to lake sturgeon.
Cool. Yeah. All right, from Maria, when sturgeon are stocked, are they only stocked once or does stocking occur multiple times?
Good question. I probably didn't clearly state that. So we started stocking Trigo Lake and the Upper Namekagon River in 1995, and we do it now every other year. And for a period of time, we were doing it every year, but sturgeon have very good survival. And so we were trying to not overwhelm the system and basically have where fish are leaving to the lower Namekagon. The overall goal at some point would be that we don't have to stock, that we'll see natural reproduction, we'll get fish that aren't tagged, and that'll tell us these are fish that were spawned naturally, and then we can discontinue that stocking program and consider it a natural population.
Awesome. Looks like we have 3 more questions in 5-ish more minutes, so I think we can get through. Next question from Allison is, do you engage fishermen?
In terms of calling
I would assume so.
Every day is the answer. So yes, I get emails, phone calls. I have people come into the office. If they talk to me on the river, I'll talk to them there. Absolutely. So yeah, if you know folks who want to call me or email me, use that contact information that's right here.
Great. All right, so from John, given the tough skin and rigid body, is hook mortality less an issue? Wondering about impact of catch and release.
Yes, so lake sturgeon are very hardy, and they actually have a much lower hooking mortality than other species, and that's part of the reason we opened the catch and release season on the St. Croix, because we know that as long as you get them back in the water in a reasonable amount of time, they will survive, and they tend to be tougher than, say, another species. Yep.
Cool. From Gordon, where do we report tagged fish?
So, I'm the easiest contact if it's up in our area. If you're in Minnesota, they actually have a tag reporting website. I don't know that link. I don't have the link off the top of my head, but I could get it for you, Gordon, if you wanted to contact me. And yeah, so either myself directly is a good place to start, or you can, if you're in Minnesota, you can try their website.
Great, awesome. We have one more question here from Lori. This is a little bit of a long one, so if you need me to repeat, just let me know. But so all of the stocked juveniles are pit tagged so that you can determine if fish caught while sampling are stocked individuals, question. And then do you have, let's start with that one first. Let's go one question at a time.
The answer is yes. Yeah, so that's why we tag them, so we can tell the difference between stocked fish and natural fish.
Great. And then the second part of that is, do you have an idea of the lower size limit of the hook and line sampling done?
As in the smallest fish we see?
Yeah, the lower size limit, she states.
I mean, we've seen them as small as 14, 15 inches is probably the lower end. And then we've seen them as big as 68, I believe, is the biggest. But a vast majority are 20 to 30 inches.
Okay, and then the second part of that question is, do you know any successful methods to use to sample smaller juvenile populations?
Yeah, so they have used what's small mesh gill nets for really small sturgeon, but it's somewhat successful. It's not as, you don't get as many fish as you normally would the way we do. And that's why we've kind of leaned on hook and line sampling.
Awesome. So we're just gonna get up our last part here. Great. So it is now 12:57. Thank you for sharing with us today, Craig, and thank you to more than, I saw at least over 45 participants who joined us. Please take a moment before you go and grab that survey link out of the chat. Your responses go towards helping us create great programming like our Lunch and Learn today. To learn more about Wild Rivers Conservancy and view our upcoming events, including our next Lunch and Learn, Do Rivers Affect Winter Survival of Emerald Ash Borer, please visit us at our website, wildriversconservancy.org. To be sure you do not miss another event, please sign up on our homepage to receive our e-news. We thank you for attending, and a special thank you again to Craig. We hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you all. And if you have any questions for me after this, feel free to contact me at craig.roberts@wisconsin.gov.
So great. Thanks, Craig. Thanks, everybody.
Have a good day.
You too.